Welcome to Reducing Risk, a series of podcasts from Medical Protection created specifically for doctors in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Reducing Risks looks at some of the key medico-legal issues in our jurisdiction and provides helpful advice and guidance on how to manage those risks. This current series focuses on demystifying the Medical Council standards. Hello, my name is Tim Cookson and I'm a medico-legal consultant to MPS. Today's topic is unprofessional behaviour, and joining me today are two highly professional colleagues, Chai-Yan Chen, a colleague at MPS. Welcome, Chai-Yan.
Hello.
And Adam Holloway from Watton & Kearney, one of the lawyers with whom we work closely. Welcome, Adam.
Hello, Tim.
So our guidance on what is unprofessional behaviour is in the Medical Council statement, unsurprisingly titled Unprofessional Behaviour, with the latest version released in 2020. And there's also significant overlap with other statements which we've discussed in other podcasts, sexual boundaries and professional boundaries. So the preamble to the statement on unprofessional behaviour is that as a doctor, you have an obligation to be respectful and professional as your behaviour may affect how a health team functions, how care is delivered to patients, and the public's trust and confidence in the medical profession. Chai-Yan, I'm very sure that you've never been unprofessional in your entire career, but as an anaesthetist, you work closely with surgeons who over the years have had a reputation for what might be described as occasionally exuberant behaviour in theatre. Can you think of any examples you've witnessed and give us your thoughts on the impact of that behaviour on those around?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and luckily it doesn't happen very much now. But I did used to work with someone whose behaviour really did affect the team around him. And normally a very affable person, but if he didn't know the team or if there were new nurses, I think it created a bit of anxiety for him, and he was often probably just very directive to the point of being micromanaging. So it was always a lumps and bumps list. It was always the same equipment, same setup, and always the first thing he would ask for would be the marking pen and local anaesthetic, because it was just a similar procedure all day long. And the nurses in this theatre, by the end of the day, they didn't know how to drape anymore. They no longer had local anaesthetic open, and they didn't have any marking pens. And you think that as the day goes on, you'd get more and more practiced, but because of how he was, how he spoke to them, and every time they asked him questions, he'd barked answers back. They just didn't know how to do the basics anymore.
That's really interesting, that impact on the team and how it functions.
That's right.
And certainly patient care will start to suffer as a result of that kind of thing. And I understand the research actually shows that the surgeon who throws something around the theatre but then gets on and does things properly, that behaviour is actually much less disruptive than the ongoing behaviour that belittles people and causes problems. Yep. So look, public trust is a theme behind the concerns over unprofessional behaviour. And as you'll hear when we come to discuss the Health Practitioners Disciplinary Tribunal, which I'll refer to as the HPDT for short, when we talk about their decisions, one of the criteria by which actions are judged is that the actions bring or are likely to bring discredit to the medical profession. And look, the public does generally have a high level of trust in doctors, as well as nurses and fire and emergency personnel, and a recent international survey showed that in New Zealand, doctors topped the standings. And various surveys have also found that patients trust their own doctor more than they trust doctors in general. And I guess this is not surprising, really. If Chai-Yan was about to anaesthetise me, I certainly need to have complete faith that she will get me awake and mentally functioning again. I'd certainly need more trust in her than what the public does, for example, for our politicians, who regularly languish at the bottom of those standings. Adam, you've had some close encounters with alleged unprofessional behaviour in your work assisting our members who have appeared before the HPDT. Could I ask you to read the section from the statement defining what unprofessional behaviour is? And I think it's worthwhile going through the full list. Firstly, to give an indication of the breadth of behaviour that can be considered unprofessional, but also as a background when we focus on the kinds of behaviour that end up with doctors in front of the HPDT. Adam.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll read that in just a moment. But before doing so, one thing I'll observe is that the description of what can be unprofessional behaviour is incredibly broad. There's no attempt by the council to list out a series of things which they all regard as unprofessional behaviour. It really can be a huge range of things. And interestingly, and you'll hear this when I read out the list, one of the things they say is that a doctor's behaviour will depend, as to whether it's unprofessional, will depend on context, including how that behaviour is perceived. So there's a recognition there that it's hard or impossible to paint bright lines. If you stay within this, you'll be fine, because you can still cause upset for somebody by behaviour that another person might think is okay. The other brief comment I'll make is that you're absolutely right, Tim, that there's that concept of bringing discredit. So there's two classes of unprofessional behaviour. There's unprofessional behaviour, which is what we call negligence or malpractice. So breaching this standard in a clinical setting would generally be regarded as negligence or malpractice. And then there's that broader concept of bringing discredit, which can result from clinical practice, but it can also result from behaviour that's entirely in your private life, but so severe that it lowers the public standing of all doctors, or at least has that potential. So what is this concept of unprofessional behaviour? It includes repeated inappropriate behaviour, as well as one-off incidents that may be disruptive. The inappropriate behaviour or incident may apply to interactions with patients, other healthcare professionals and colleagues, or outside of work. Workplaces often have policies that outline what unprofessional behaviour is and how it should be addressed. Whether a doctor's behaviour is unprofessional often depends on the context and how that behaviour is perceived. Unprofessional behaviour does not necessarily only occur within the healthcare setting. It can also extend to behaviours outside the healthcare team and can damage the trust and confidence that patients have in their doctor and how the public perceives the medical profession. While it is not possible to list every action or behaviour that may be considered unprofessional, it includes, but is not limited to, behaviour such as bullying, intimidation or harassment, discrimination, racism, insensitivity or rudeness towards others, putting your own interests ahead of your patients, violent, abusive, threatening or offensive behaviour, demanding, aggressive, including passive-aggressive, and overly critical comments or behaviour, or refusal to work collaboratively with others, or to follow best practice. Inappropriate communication, including the use of social media, can also be considered unprofessional, whether this is directly related to a doctor's work or not. While there may be a number of reasons for unprofessional behaviour, whether personal, professional, or situational, as a doctor, you must demonstrate professional behaviour at all times. So pretty comprehensive and open-ended. Anything and everything could fit within that, and the sorts of cases we deal with bear testament to exactly that. People have been found to have behaved unprofessionally in so many different ways. Chow Yen, what's your view of that broad definition?
Listening to it, I think that you really can be reported for anything. Like you say, one person might find it acceptable and the other person another person won't. So worthwhile having a think. We were talking about earlier, having a think before you open your mouth. If you're about to say something a little unconventional or something that is perhaps a little bit out there, someone might take offence and report you to the medical council.
This particularly applies, doesn't it, to social media?
That's right.
Which is starting to feature more and more in the HPDT cases. And inappropriate communication, especially by social media, can be considered unprofessional, whether it is directly related to a doctor's work or not. So it may be something out of your private life that you're making comments on social media, and someone takes objection to it and says, this person's a doctor.
That's right.
That makes them different from anybody else, and that anybody else can make that comment, but that a doctor can't. It's a pretty exhaustive list, isn't it, Adam? And yet I note your bit that it's not an exclusive list. So the medical council can add a whole lot of other things if they want to that list. And just in case anyone from the council is listening, I would like to make a confession now that I may have, on very rare occasions, been a little insensitive to others. And so I guess now would be a good time for me to check that you are both feeling okay. Cheyenne and Adam, you're all...
So far, so good.
So, yeah,
Sure,
very
okay,
safe,
sure.
very safe.
Okay, and although we've used the medical council as an example, other health regulatory bodies have similar statements regarding unprofessional behaviour. So look, Adam's given us the list, but so what? Where can this kind of behaviour, if it's notified to the medical council, end up? And as Adam hinted, I'd like to make it clear that employers will have policies and procedures relating to behaviour, and we won't be discussing those. We're just going to be talking about the medico-legal implications. So if we look at the annual report for the Medical Council, they received 132 notifications in the 21 to 2022 year relating to conduct. The Nursing Council didn't actually specify in their 2020 year, which is the most recent that I could find, but they referred 27 nurses to a PCC, and a further 27 nurses had court convictions considered by PCCs. In the Medical Council, in the most recent year, there were 33 referrals to a PCC, and that would include 4 court convictions. So the PCC, that's a Professional Conduct Committee. Cheyenne, do you want to give us a sort of a very brief summary of what a PCC is, just for the purposes of today's podcast?
Yeah, so the Professional Conduct Committee is appointed by the council, but separate to it. If the council considers that the information it receives raises questions about the conduct or the safety of a doctor's practice, it may then refer these to a PCC. And it's made up of 3 members, 2 doctors and 1 non-doctor. One of the members is appointed as the facilitator, and the person arranges meetings and interviews and ensures that the PCC's processes are fair and conducted in a timely manner.
So the PCC, the members, apart from there's one appointed by the council, isn't it? But the other 2 are doctors from the profession who've agreed to be on PCC. So they're not council employees as such. But they do have a serious job to do of investigating and ultimately making that decision is if the behaviour is regarded to be in breach of a statement or whatever, does disciplinary action, is it warranted to lay a charge with the HPDT?
So if you get notified to the council because you've alleged an allegation has been made that you've behaved unprofessionally, there are 2 thresholds you have to get through before you might reach the tribunal. First, the council will hear what you have to say about the incident and decide whether or not it's serious enough that it deserves a closer look by a PCC. So if it's a lower level thing, the council might decide that it's not something worthy of moving through the process. The second step, if it is potentially a serious example of unprofessional conduct, they'll send it to a PCC. The PCC's job is to investigate, gather further information, and then make the fundamental decision based on the information we've gathered. Should we be charging this doctor with professional misconduct before the HPDT or not? They don't always do that. Sometimes they'll refer it back to the council and say, look, we've investigated. Yes, a bad thing happened, but probably this doctor, it's sufficient if you just tell them off. But then in other cases, they'll say, no, we need to go through the formal process of charging the doctor with professional misconduct and having the tribunal, which is essentially a court, decide whether or not that charge is established or not. And once you're there, that's as serious as it gets for a doctor, because it's the tribunal, if it finds that a charge of professional misconduct has been established, that has the jurisdiction to suspend you or to cancel your registration in the most severe cases.
And so just clarifying that process, so out of the 132 notifications that went to the council, there were only 33 referrals that went to a PCC. So the vast majority, 3/4, were dealt with by the preliminary process.
Yeah, at that lower level, at that initial triage. And then of the 33 that went to PCC, only a subset of those would have resulted in cases before the tribunal.
Yeah, and some of them are sort of slam dunk type things where if you've been convicted, for example, of something in the courts, then that will automatically, or almost automatically go through to an HPDT hearing if the conviction is for a crime that's serious enough to warrant that. Yep. So let's have a look at a couple of cases to see what happens at the HPDT. And one relatively recent one referred to a psychiatrist who was treating a patient for depression. A sexual relationship developed, which was discovered when her personal trainer saw sexually explicit images on her phone. And I really don't want to know how that occurred. The HPDT found that his behaviour was a serious breach of professional boundaries, likely to bring discredit to the profession. His registration was cancelled, so that's pretty much the most severe of the sanctions that the HPDT can do, and a subsequent appeal by the practitioner to the High Court failed. Comments, Adam?
Yeah, I mean, there is a separate statement dealing with transgressions of personal boundaries or having sexual relationships with patients, which is essentially prohibited, but it would also be regarded as unprofessional conduct of the more severe sort. Really, if as a doctor you have entered into an intimate relationship with someone who either is a patient or has been a patient, then you're already extremely likely to be the subject of sanction. It would only be in the rarest of cases that an intimate relationship that's developed, for example, with someone who was briefly a patient a long time ago, and in a context where there could not be any question of a power dynamic in favour of the doctor, that you might be able to squeak through and convince the tribunal that it's not worthy of punishment. But the standard response to sleeping with your patient would be deregistration, and we try and fight hard to go down from there. But that's always got to be in the forefront of your mind if you've made that choice to strike up a relationship. Here, obviously, the patient was particularly vulnerable because they were being treated for depression, and the power dynamic was acutely wrong, I would imagine, because the doctor involved was a treating psychiatrist.
And certainly I think doctors are pretty much aware of that statement. And I remember a long conversation I had many years ago with a doctor who was ringing up because they knew that they were about to form a close relationship with a patient, and they had decided that actually the relationship was more important than their profession, and they were ringing to discuss stopping work as a doctor completely because of that. So it's pretty cut and dried, really. And certainly the council is taking a firm line on any allegation of sexual misconduct, and they've certainly signalled that that firm line will continue. So we couldn't discuss unprofessional behaviour without some mention of COVID-19. And there have been a couple of cases already in front of the HBDT involving nurses, and then a recent one involving a doctor. So the doctor was charged with making radio broadcast statements and public statements that contained inaccurate or misleading statements, were disparaging of, and had unprofessional criticism of other health practitioners. And there were multiple charges, which is actually common for the PCCs these days, because they tend to do a lot of digging after the initial notification to find out if there's other material that might warrant attention. Now, many of the charges were not upheld, but overall, the tribunal decided that this was professional misconduct and likely to bring discredit to the profession and warranting disciplinary sanction. And the penalty has yet to be decided, so this is a very recent case. Cheyenne, this test for bringing discredit to the profession, would you mind just reading out the High Court determination for that?
Where the reasonable members of the public, properly informed, could reasonably conclude that the reputation and good standing of the profession was lowered by the behaviour of the practitioner.
It's an interesting statement, isn't it? But I think it's pretty clear, really. Though there's room for wriggle room, I imagine a lawyer will find a lot in that to discuss. And this case is obviously much more nuanced than the previous one, because it's balancing an individual's right to free speech against standards that are set by a regulator. Adam, I know you're involved in this case, and there are obviously things that you can't discuss. Do you think this case helps to clarify what unprofessional behaviour is in relation to, for example, public statements and Facebook, etc.?
Yeah, I'll talk in general terms, not about this case in particular, but a number of practitioners came to the Medical Council's attention through the pandemic of COVID-19 for expressing views that I think it's fair to say were in the minority, or for recommending or providing treatments that, again, would have been regarded as minority views. And it has been interesting to see the profession grapple with that and that incredibly difficult balance between freedom of expression, which is a right we all have, protected under the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act, balanced against the responsibilities you take on when you choose to join a profession. And I think finding that balance and answering these questions is still difficult, even today, perhaps because we've only had a small number of cases go through to the level of the tribunal, and none yet have gone on appeal to hear what the High Court has to say about striking the right balance. But taking a big step back and reflecting on it all, I think it's fair to say that the profession remains one that is reasonably cohesive in New Zealand in terms of the views that it takes, particularly at the governance level, at council, the sorts of people who might go on to PCCs or be part of the panel of the Health Practitioners Disciplinary Tribunal. It will always be risky to express in public views stridently different from, quote unquote, the mainstream. You're going to get people's backs up. Someone will complain about you, and then will ensue a very, very long grinding process of working through the various levels of discipline through ultimately to a tribunal hearing. So it seems to me that in terms of keeping out of trouble, things doctors can have a think about is talk to your colleagues. Perhaps don't go from reading something on the internet straight through to a public pronouncement about that. Maybe share ideas with people you trust. Get a feel for what others might think about it. Explore how you can engage in debate about a new issue, whether that be gender affirming care or COVID-19 or other things that people get politically wound up about, that doesn't go in volume from 0 to 10 straight away. Because you'll probably start to get a sense of what the community of doctors around you feels about that, and whether or not it's something that you might need to pause and get some advice on before you choose to go public with your views. But it's a very hard issue, Tim, and it's hard for all sorts of sort of philosophical reasons. I could talk for hours, but there's real benefit in not discouraging doctors from challenging institutional views. It's a good thing for doctors prepared to do things like go and remove the Broad Street pump handle at a time when everyone thought he was bonkers for doing so, but proved right in the long term. So we don't want to stifle debate, but we need to have debate in a context and in a way that's not going to immediately bring down the scrutiny of the council if that's not what you want in your life, because it can become really quite hard to have these lengthy battles.
Thank you. There are a couple of interesting findings in the full decision about this case, and you were talking about context, Adam, and I think this is one particularly where the context is important. So one of the phrases that was used a lot in publicity and by this doctor was the phrase experimental biological agent in reference to the COVID-19 vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine. And the tribunal found that this was misleading and likely to undermine public confidence in the vaccine. Of course, remembering this was at a time when the vaccine was very new, and so that's probably not a phrase that would be used now, because the time that's gone past. So the context there was particularly important for that particular decision. The tribunal also found that statements by the doctor where he alleged that the medical council had instructed doctors just to advise of the benefits of the vaccine and not the potential risks, and furthermore that the medical council was inciting doctors to break the law, the tribunal found that was disparaging, but it didn't amount to professional misconduct on its own. And this is, I think, an important thing with the HPDT generally, is that often there'll be a number of different things that the tribunal will find against a doctor, and that on their own, a single one wouldn't reach the threshold for professional misconduct, but cumulatively, taken together, they do represent professional misconduct. I'd like now to give you just a brief summary of the last 10 HPDT decisions, just to give you a flavour of the issues that are most commonly considered. And this is against that background of the number of potential things that Adam read out that the Medical Council might consider to be professional misconduct. So of the last 10, 4 because of court convictions for assault, clearly pretty serious. 2 were for sexual relationships with patients, and we've covered that pretty thoroughly. 2 were for statements that were found to be misleading or disparaging of other practitioners. And that again comes back to this comment, and particularly Adam's thoughts on, talk with your colleagues, and not just the colleagues that you know agree with your point of view, but with other colleagues as well, about whether going public on this might engender a little more interest from the Medical Council than what you might want. And only 1 was for clinical issues, which is interesting, 1 out of 10. So most of the HPDT cases are not, in fact, because we've stuffed up in a clinical manner, but because our behaviour has led to the HPDT being involved. And then finally, one was withdrawn after the PCC acknowledged that the particular alcohol issues of that doctor were a health issue, and also that the doctor had ceased practice and therefore there was no benefit to the public from continuing. If we look for a comparison with nurses, there were 2 for court convictions, 3 for sexual misconduct, and one of those was not guilty, 2 for false information or using documents falsely, 2 for disparaging public comments, so again that theme, and then 1 for bullying, which was withdrawn. And which health practitioners are most at risk? Well, the raw numbers show that nurses feature most commonly, followed by doctors, and then we have pharmacists, physios, psychologists and chiropractors, followed by a smattering of osteopaths, midwives and anaesthetic technicians. And I think those rankings probably reflect the overall numbers in each profession, and that is certainly not a statistical analysis. So, are we any clearer on what unprofessional behaviour is, and which behaviours are the ones that are most likely to end with the most severe of outcomes, which is a guilty finding at the HPDT? Cheyenne, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's the obvious ones, the sexual misconduct, where the power imbalance is obvious and not in favour of the patient, so not in their best interests, and definitely brings the reputation into disrepute. But I think there's a lot of grey in this area, and a lot of different issues come up before the PCC or are referred to PCC. Even having a perceived financial conflict of interest has been referred before. So I definitely think it's really hard to know. So think about perhaps before you go do that thing that you're a little bit unsure about, perhaps think about if you were to read about this in the morning paper, what would your reaction be? If you think, oh, that's okay, then probably it might be okay. But if you think, oh, I'd question that coming from a doctor, then I'd go along with those thoughts instead for a happier life.
Yeah, and that certainly highlights the different expectations that there are on doctors and other health professionals compared with the general public.
Yeah.
You know, there are things that we just can't do and expect to get away with them that anybody else might. So it is a very special kind of circumstance that we have as doctors. And I guess if we look at the kind of behaviours, the full list, the non-exclusive full list that is in the Medical Council statement, any of which might end up in front of a PCC. And although I guess we haven't really emphasised just the impact that appearing just before a PCC can have, it's quite clear that looking through the HPDT decisions, only a small proportion of those unprofessional behaviours are likely to appear in front of the HPDT. But maybe you'd like to comment, sort of final comments, Adam, on that issue of PCCs and the HPDT and unprofessional behaviour.
Yeah, well, it was really interesting, Tim, to hear that carve up of what the recent cases were about. And I agree with Chow Yin that there's obvious things. Don't sleep with patients, conduct that's criminal, irrespective of whether or not you're a doctor. Conduct that's dishonest will always be pretty straightforward. The harder types of conduct, but also probably the ones that generate more notifications, are communications within the profession that have not gone well. You know, whether it's been accused of being bullying or you've lost your temper with a colleague, that kind of thing absolutely can be unprofessional. Very clear precedent, but it will always be quite a hard-fought discussion around context and whether it was repeated behaviour or whether it had a severe enough effect on the person who heard it that it ought to be regarded as being as bad as a formal finding of professional misconduct. The stuff that's new that we see that I think people need to slow down and pause about is interactions more broadly with the public, often facilitated through social media or the internet. Saying things online that are racist, pretty straightforward way of getting yourself in serious trouble. Attacking other people online, also poor form. The more difficult end of the spectrum is engaging in public debate in a way that the majority of your profession, who, to be frank, are also likely to be the people judging that conduct, may violently disagree with, for better or ill. And that's probably the hardest discussion that we as lawyers have had to engage with. But you will always do better, I think, by slowing down and talking with others, whether that be MPS or a lawyer or a trusted friend or colleague, about how to engage in those sorts of debates in a way that is either safe or at least safer than forging ahead. Because there's now clear precedent in the tribunal level, at least, that it can be unprofessional to engage in a debate in a way where the majority of your colleagues would say that that's not well evidenced and contrary to the profession's expectations of promoting public health, good public health.
And certainly one of the criticisms of that tribunal case was that the doctor wasn't able to produce the evidence to back up his statements.
Yeah, and one, that's the only thing I'll say on the case. It's interesting that only a small part of the charge was established. The bits where it wasn't established is where, whether or not you agree with what was being said, it was actually said in a relatively measured way, and it was connected with references or material, again, whether or not you think that they're persuasive. That's the stuff that could be criticised, and indeed the tribunal did criticise much of it, but said, well, it's not professional misconduct. It's those occasions where you say something strident or is something that is not supported at all or crosses that line to being, struggling for the right word, intemperate or too passionate, that you're going to find yourself having stepped over the line. So it's an easy thing for a lawyer to say, is stop and have a think before you talk, but nonetheless, I think it's always good advice.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. So look, in closing then, I'd like to thank you both, Cheyenne and Adam, very much for the podcast today, and also to all of you for listening to this podcast. If you have any medico-legal questions, you're welcome to call us on 0800 22 55677, and as Adam mentioned, we are certainly one of the sources that you can come to if you're about to make a statement in public that you think might need to be thought about more carefully. I'm sure we'll have a view, and we look forward to catching up with you on our next podcast. If you like these medical protection podcasts, please subscribe and leave a review. If you would like a podcast on a specific topic, please email nzpodcasts@medicalprotection.org.